O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
Democracy is derived from the Greek word demokratia, meaning rule by the people. And as I said, my working definition for today's stream of what a democracy is where people living under political institutions exercise control over those political institutions. And so within the Athenian context, it has its earliest roots in the 5th century, as we've already talked about. And it emerged as a radical form of governance when compared to the prevailing system of monarchy and oligarchy at the time. And so there's three major, you could call them reforms or influences. The first one being Solon, who laid the foundational changes by alleviating debt and redistributing political power from the aristocracy and the wealthy, which again, the vast majority of the Athenian populace at that time was indebted to these aristocratic noble elites within Athens. And because there was going to be so much unrest and upheaval, that Solon came and said, look, we're going to do away with their debts and we're going to issue them political power to avoid the upheaval that's getting ready to happen. And this was resisted, obviously, by the aristocrats and the elites. And this is going to be true even later in Athenian democracy. There's quotes from Aristotle and Plato highlighting their contempt, at least certain people's contempt for democracy, because there's always a contention. When we start looking at there's always a contention between the few and the many. And as I was reading through it, I kept referencing back in my mind the philosophical dialectic between the one and the many, right? Which one's more real, the one or the many? And when we look at these government structures, this is also true. Which one has the most power? Which one should have the power, the few or the many? Obviously, for Plato, if you've read the Republic, he wanted a sort of educated elite to rule, and he believed that democracy was actually inept, and that giving incompetent people in his frame the power to vote and make decisions for the city-state was moronic. And he believed in more of a sort of oligarchy, an elite oligarchy that was going to rule the country. So eventually, there's quotes that I found from these Greek elites that said that they wanted to enact evil against the demos, the populace, the people, because they felt that they had too much power. And when you look at America, it sure feels like we're moving not towards the democratic ideals, but certainly further away, where fewer and fewer people have the majority of the wealth, and the demos, the populace, the people, are more and more indebted to those elites. So I just wanted to make that the case, because when we look at the American context, I think we can still see the war raging between the few and the many. But the difference is and we'll get into media and propaganda and some of the problems with democracy, the criticisms that aren't just mine, but have been leveled by academics for the last really 300 years, that you have to have an educated, informed populace. And we, unfortunately, do not. And so the divisions amongst the masses are ways in which the elite can preserve their power and actually acquire more power within a democratic structure. So, and that's ultimately going to undermine democracy, which I think we all know that we're moving towards a centralized government, whether that be the New World Order or even nation states becoming more explicitly communist. So, okay, so Solon's reforms, and so then he redistributed political power from the aristocracy and the wealthy based on income rather than birth. And so then Clinton's reforms in 508 to 507 introduced more radical reforms that established the basis for Athenian democracy, including the restructuring of the tribal system and increasing the power of the assembly, the ecclesia, where citizens could participate directly in legislative decisions. And so this is really important, because what Athenian democracy becomes is it moves from the ultimate power of a small group of people to the ecclesia. The assembly becomes the ultimate source of power. And this is where the average man, again, an adult, male, free Athenian, can come here and cast votes on decisions of wartime, economics, taxes, and they would meet 10 times a year at the Pnyx. So this was a particular place in Athens where the votes would occur. And so the ability of the assembly to overturn the decisions of the Council of 500 or the Areopagus, this is what made Athenian democracy so unique, is that literally the Athenian men could come together and they could make decisions right then and there based on their direct democratic voting. Now, Pericles also had a major influence, and this is around 461 through 429, and he expanded democracy through the payment for public offices and jury duties, allowing even the poorest citizens to participate in the state's affairs. And this was novel, because before there was still a class structure in regards to Athenian democracy in which that the wealthier aristocratic people had more power and more status than the thetes, the poor people, the manual laborers. You can think it as the lower blue collar, the lower middle class. But what happens after Pericles is that the thetes were able to participate in the assembly. And so they themselves could actually begin to vote out the most powerful people. Now, some of the unique characteristics of Athenian democracy is what's called direct democracy. And this really is purely mob rule. And so all decisions are made directly by the citizens who attended the assemblies without any sort of intermediary representatives. This is one of the big distinctions between American democracy and Athenian democracy, is we have an indirect democracy in which we don't control the government itself. We control through election the representatives who represent us, who then control the government. And so we'll highlight how this is problematic, because if the representatives are controlled, well, then the people, no matter how many elections, and even if they were totally fair and free, still do not actually control the government. And so again, our working definition, where the people under a political institution exercise control over the political institution. And one of the questions when we look at American democracy is, do the people in America still exercise full sovereignty and control over its government? And I think the question and the answer to that question is going to become no. It doesn't seem like we do anymore. So direct democracy is mob rule, but this is what was unique about Athenian democracy, along with the lottery system. So as that video mentioned, when we look at the assembly, most public officials were chosen by lot, literally their names, essentially a metaphor pulled out of a hat. And this was seen as a democratic way to prevent corruption and power accumulation. So therefore, a thetes, a poor, lower middle class working person, could actually be elevated to the assembly as part of the Council of 500. So that was huge, and they viewed that as very democratic. Where again, you can look at the American context. We don't really have a lottery system, because the people who run for office are in ways chosen by other powerful institutions. When we look at super PACs, when we look at the political parties choosing who their representatives are, when we look at the donor money behind certain candidates, unfortunately, in the American context, we cannot just elect anybody we want to elect. And now in a very explicit case, that's even Donald Trump with the attacks that are going on right now. Well, no matter what you think about Donald Trump, I'm not here to defend Donald Trump. My point is, in a authentic democracy, something that was more akin to the Athenian context, we would be able to elect whoever we wanted. And then limited citizenship. So political rights were limited, as I said, to male citizens who completed military training. Women, slaves, and all foreigners were excluded from any democratic process within Athens. And this is where some of the contemporary academics and scholars are critical of Athens, because they made explicit that the role of women was to be in the home. And I have this one point that I thought was really interesting, that when the Greeks were formulating their democratic ideals, they said that there's a difference between the rulers and the ruled. And the main distinction is that the rulers rule with their mind, meaning these are people that are led by a sort of conscious, self-critical, thinking behavior. Whereas they said the ruled people that are ruled by the body, ruled by the body. And so they associated men with being typically ruled by mind, being more rational. And they equated women with being more ruled by the body. But I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about OnlyFans and the sexual degeneracy in our country. And, it seems in a way that in the American populace, more and more people are becoming ruled by their body. And the ability to not be ruled by your body means that you can never actually be part of the ruling class or rule anybody else because you're ruled by your own body. So I thought that was really interesting. But anyways, moving on here, comparing Athens then to the democracy of the United States. In the United States, we have foundational documents, the Declaration of Independence, 1776. We have the Constitution, 1787, established the legal and philosophical basis for American democracy. We have the Federalist Papers written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. These documents argued for a strong federal government and a system of checks and balances because, unlike the Athenians, the founding fathers were very worried about political factions. And I think it was Madison that described a faction is really in the world of politics. Politics are described by factions, and factions are different subgroups of people that have certain political ideals or ambitions. And he argued that no matter what the faction is, and no matter what the faction is looking for, the faction will always do what's in best for the preservation and the establishment of those factions' ideals. And therefore, he was afraid that if enough people of the same faction became the majority, that they would dominate. And a perfect example of this would be Shays' Rebellion. If you guys are familiar with Shays' Rebellion, here, let me pull that up real quick. Are you guys... So that would be right here. So Shays' Rebellion, this was when, right after the founding of the country. So this is during 1786 and 1787. This is when fighting took place because revolutionaries, or the Shayites, who protested against the economic and civil rights injustices by the Massachusetts government, and they wanted to take over the Springfield Armory, and basically they felt they were being overly taxed. Well, this was part and parcel of again, these checks and balances that some of the founding fathers thought, well, geez, if enough people decide that they don't want to pay taxes to the federal government, well, that could be a problem because they could just overthrow the government itself. And therefore, they created all these checks and balances to limit. And we'll look into the legislative branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. But anyways, moving forward, we have the Bill of Rights, 1791. The unique attributes of American democracy is that it's a representative democracy. Therefore, it's an indirect democracy, and that citizens only elect representatives. They do not have total political control over the government itself, and those representatives make decisions on their behalf, a system designed to manage the large and geographic state of the United States, which, okay, that makes sense. You can't have a direct democracy like Athens when somebody lives in California or Washington State and they're having a vote within an hour in Washington, D.C. That doesn't really work. So that's part of the logic behind why the founding fathers wanted a representative democracy. Then we have a constitutional framework, and constitutional ideals really come out of the Enlightenment. So there was no constitution for the Athenian democratic structure. It's a written constitution that outlines the structure of the government and the rights of individuals, including amendments to adapt to changing conditions. And this is because, as we've talked about with the Enlightenment, it goes back to the valorization of the ideals of equality, fraternity, and liberty. Now, equality and liberty were the main ones for the United States. And then really, in regards to fraternity, you could really use independence as the third ideal for the founding fathers, which is why they associate the pursuit of happiness. Well, the pursuit of happiness is indicative of an independent, free person being able to pursue their own desired ideals and their desired ends. So equality, though, in the American context, and this is explicit, it was not equity. It was the belief that, in Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, right? And this is the idea that that's what equality is, and that we all begin from the same place, but It's not about equality of outcome. It was about the establishing of an authentic meritocracy. That was the ideal of the democracy, or the equality and liberty and independence within the American context. Whether you think that came to fruition or not, that certainly begs questioning and deserves answers. But that was at least the intended ideal. And then we had federalism, which is, again, very different in regards to other forms of democracy. So federalism is power is divided between the national and the state governments, allowing for local autonomy within a united framework. And obviously, when we look at the Civil War, federalism was a main driver to the conflict of the Civil War. I'm not going to go into the details of the Civil War or not, but let's just say there was more problems going on than just slavery. Okay, because the majority of Southerners who fought in the Civil War, they didn't even own slaves. It was about monetary policy. It was about federal power, states' rights, these types of things. And so you can see, and this is one of the things that have been noted throughout history, that men or any institution that is given power will always, under all circumstances, try to acquire more power. And so I think there's a really strong case that shows that the United States is, in fact, becoming more and more a centrally, not federalist in the sense of states' power, but federally, centrally powered by the federal government. So wanted to put that out there. Now, some of the big differences, again, between Athenian and American democracies was the form of participation. Athenian, like I said, is direct democracy, involvement in decision-making. American is indirect participation in democracy. The inclusion of citizens. So in Athenian democracy, only male Athenian free men were allowed to vote. In American, initially limited to property-owning white men. So we still see the initial ethos of the American democratic structure was that white free men that owned property, because they, in the American context, and I'm going to say more about this, in the American context, they saw the ownership of property as indicative of independence. And so that was a huge differentiation between like a feudal system or even a monarchical system where the land is privately owned. They said, no, we want public ownership, or we want private ownership of the land by the public, by the citizens. And they viewed that then property ownership was essential for any people to be free. Now I bring it back to America in 2024. Are they making it easier for us to own private property? Or are they making it harder for us to own private property? And if they're making it harder for us to own private property, which is obviously the case, well, then they're moving it directly in opposition to the promotion of any sort of individual freedom in this country. So just throwing that out there as well. Government structure differences. Athenian was primarily focused on the assembly and the councils, which limited executive roles, and the American was structured with separate executive, legislative, and judicial branches, each defined and have their own powers and controls over the other branches of government. And then the legal framework is that the Athenians lacked a written constitution. As I said, this is really an Enlightenment ideal. And so the laws were created and could be changed by the assembly at any point. That was one of the things about the Athenian democracy, in which the assembly did, the free men did. Laws would be created. They didn't like them anymore. They would vote. They'd do away with that law. In the American context, we have governed by a constitution that only guides the legal system, but also restricts governmental powers through checks and balances. And then the rule of law, as I said, decisions often based on majority rule within the Athenian context. Within the American context, emphasis on the protection of individual and minority rights through a detailed Bill of Rights and ongoing legal interpretations. Now, the key institutions for Athenian democracy. Let me pull down Shays' Rebellion. We're not talking about that anymore. So some of the key elements or the key structures of Athenian democracy is, number one, as I said, the ecclesia, the assembly. The role, this is the center of power in American democracy. And this is where the average man, as long as you were male, adult, and free and Athenian, you could participate. The assembly was the principal decision-making body in the Athenian democracy. All citizens have the right to attend its meetings, speak, and vote on legislation, foreign policy, and other critical matters. The meetings were held at the Pnyx, a hill in Athens, and the assembly met around 10 to 40 times a year, depending on the situation. And so in Athens, one of the problems that were emerging over and over and over and over is the problem of war. That war, whether whoever it may be, obviously they had many enemies, and really the defeat of the Persians at Salamis and Marathon was essential for giving the Athenians, a sort of the average Athenian soldier, a sense of self-confidence. That is why they wanted to enact and establish democracy in the first place. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in here in just a second. I have all these notes, but military participation and military service and competency was very much tied with political ascendancy. So within the Athenian context, a great warrior, a great general, was seen to be worthy to sort of have voice and opinion and power over the populace. And we even see this in the American context with George Washington. So we see this mirrored also in America, that the men that were willing to fight and die and lead men in battle were deemed worthy then to lead the populace, generally speaking. You can look at somebody like Andrew Jackson as another indicator of this. Now you look at contemporary America. Look at America in 2024. Even including Donald Trump. Do we have people that are going to be representative or important players in American democracy that have ever led men in war, that are great warriors, that would be willing to die for the nation state? Of course not. Of course not. But historically, that was always an attribute that was valorized by the people. And so I just want to throw that in there as well. The powers that the assembly had is that it had the ultimate authority on almost every aspect of public policy, including laws, war, and financial decisions. Then they had the Council of 500. The Council of 500 was responsible for administrating the decisions made by the assembly and handling the daily affairs of the state. This is where people by lottery were appointed to the Council of 500. And so the average person, and they were always being sifted through, could be part of the powerful Council of 500. The members of the council were chosen by lot, a method believed to be the most democratic, as it prevented power accumulation and corruption. Each of Athens' 10 tribes provided 50 members. And so this is one of the reforms that was done by who was it? It was Clynthes that wanted to have the 10 tribes of Athens basically appoint their 50 representatives to the Council of 500. Then we have the task of the Council of 500, which the council prepared legislation for consideration and approval by the assembly, supervised government officials, and managed diplomatic relations. And then you have the courts in Athens. And obviously, they were crucial for maintaining justice and handling legal disputes. Unlike modern courts, they did not have any professional judges. Instead of large juries of citizens, they were selected by lot to hear cases and decide outcomes. And then the jurisdiction, they dealt with a wide ranging of issues, including criminal trials, civil disputes, political misconduct, and the like. And then we talked about the magistrates, the additional mechanisms. The archons were selected by lot. These officials carried out various administrative and judicial duties, but where powers were significantly curtailed compared to early pre-democratic times, because the archons of the Areopagus, they were appointed for life. And again, they were not under the same rule of law. And then ostracism, where they can, if you really did something bad and 6,000 Athenians decided you need to go, they can literally vote you out of the city-state and you cannot come back for 10 years. And if you do, you could be physically harmed. So now I want to make a few points again, looking at Athens specifically here. 507 is when the Athenians really began to adopt democracy. And in 404, Athens loses to Sparta, which was one of the brief periods in which the democratic golden age was broken up, because Sparta ruled over Athens for a short period of time. But democracy in this golden age ends, as we said, in 321 by Macedonia and their winning of these battles at that time. Now, the Athenians and Greeks cherished wisdom. And when I reflected on what did the Americans really valorize when they founded the country, And I think it's capital. Now, I don't know. I don't know if any scholar or if there's been any academic work done on this. So this is my own personal opinion. But the ways in which the Greeks and the Athenians specifically valorized men of wisdom, meaning holding up as cultural figures, they became popular. You know, again, think of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. These were men who were deemed to be incredibly wise, incredibly erudite, and those characteristics were valorized by the populace. In the American context, you could say to some degree it was that, but I would really put my finger on the thing that was really valorized in the American context in the forming of our democracy was about capital and money. And we've talked a little bit about Max Weber's thesis of the Protestant work ethic, and that because of the lack of a sort of sacramental reality and because of some of the theological errors of Calvinism as such, people began to associate hard work and labor as ways in which they could become worthy in God's eyes. Because again, the sola fide, the single proclamation of your faith, was deemed that, you know, you were assured that you were going to be saved. If you died, you're going to make it to the kingdom. But ways in which Protestants really acted out, because again, they are against works, no works, no works. But according to James, you know, without works, faith alone is dead. That the Protestants really began to see labor and the acquisition of capital as essential for independence and a sort of elevation of the modern man, or at least the Enlightenment man. And I think we still see that in America, right? What do we valorize? We valorize people that make a lot of money. We valorize the people like the Bezoses of the world, the Elon Musk of the world, professional athletes that make enormous amounts of sums to play sports. I think that is still part of the American ethos, is that we actually, as a populace, do not valorize wisdom. We valorize capital. We valorize capital. So again, that's my own opinion, but I'm going to throw that out there. I think it's accurate. You guys can let me know if you disagree or not. And so they cherish wisdom, and they believe that living under a rational law. This is why Solon and his reform about the rule of law was so important, because the Greeks presupposed that living under a rational law civilized men, that men without law, anarchy, would become barbarous, and that they would revert to non-natural or at least irrational behavior. Okay, that makes sense to me. And so they believe that with the rule of law, that everybody was subject to the same rational law, that men would become less barbarous and more civilized. And therefore, the rule of law, not limited to democracy, was essential for a civilized democracy. Without everybody being under the same rule of law, there is no such thing as a civilized democracy, because what we have then is really just a distorted, quote unquote, democratic structure in which the people that are outside the rule of law are going to control the levers of government and power, which looks like that's what we have. So for then, everyone was under the same law. And this was a Greek term called isonomia. Isonomia, that there was equality for everyone under the law, that the Athenians did not believe that everybody was equal, in the sense, at least not in the Jeffersonian Declaration of Independence sense. And they didn't believe that everybody was equal in competency and skill sets, but they believed that everybody should be equal under the rule of law, which there would equally civilize the populace and allow for more justice to occur, at least in their perspective. And this was an essential Western idea. So Western civilization has sort of been founded on this principle of the rule of law that we really get from this golden era within Athenian democracy. And as I said, military service was highly, highly privileged with the Athenian context. And the link grew between military service and political power, which again, even in the American context, we can see with George Washington and somebody like Andrew Jackson. So the Athenian citizens grew in confidence, as I mentioned. Athenian democracy, really, you could make an argument, at least I would make an argument, could not exist without the defeating of the Persians at Marathon and Salamis. because the Athenians at this time, this little city state, was able to defeat the largest empire in the world at that point, it gave so much confidence to the populace that they felt like they could rule themselves. And you can see that again flip-flop with looking at the American context. The American Revolution was 13 colonies, and really 10% of the population of fighting men were able to overthrow the largest military and government power in the world at the time, which was the British Empire. And so it's so interesting. I think there's a correlation there that it's not explicit, but it's interesting nonetheless, that needs to be enumerated, that the people of these nations that found these sort of democratic ideals, in both instances within the American and the Athenian context, it comes after a great victory of what was perceived to be the greatest power in the world at that time. And so we talked about Solon's reforms. We talked about the Areopagus. Where were the democratic decisions made? The Pnyx, we talked about that in the assembly. And so in the assembly, another thing that was essential for Athenian democracy, which was true for the American context, was isogoria. Isogoria is the Greek word for essentially free public political speech. And so they had free speech, and they were allowed to say, let's say, non-politically correct things. And they believed that having free speech, and when the assembly, the average men were able to come together, and it was outdoors. I was reading about some of the instances. They said it was sometimes difficult because it was outdoors, that, men would have to stand up. Everybody else would have to be quiet, and they would have to shout their ideals or whatever it is that they wanted to say. But they thought that was essential, that the body politic should be able to say anything regarding the concerns and the well-being of the state itself. Now you look again at the contemporary state of America. Do we have free speech? Literally, the new CEO of NPR, which is a publicly funded corporation, said that the number one hurdle they have as a news agency is the free speech, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Why would the media's biggest threat be free speech? I thought we lived in a democracy. I thought everybody was telling me on NPR about how democracy's under threat, and why we need more and more democracy, and why we got to go to Iraq and Afghanistan to spread democracy, why we got to go to Ukraine to spread democracy. What's going on here? It seems to me that America and the political power seem to be almost entirely in opposition to these founding principles that they say they're in favor for. Interesting. So the assembly had, as I said, the real power, and they could veto something that came from the Council of 500. They could rewrite it, or they could veto it and rewrite a new bill completely right there on the spot, and then force the council to push it through. And so another interesting thing that I found is that one of the reasons why Athenian democracy fell, obviously Macedon comes and they conquer, but one of the problems that emerged is that they began to pay public officials more and more money. And therefore, Athenian democracy depended on empire. It depended on the expansion of the city-state of Athens. Without the expansion of the city-state of Athens, it was unable to provide enough wealth and monetary success to maintain the system that is. And you see the same thing in the American context, that this American democracy and American freedom that we're sort of always told about is dependent upon the expansion of the empire. Very interesting. So increased pay for political positions meant that the city-state of Athens constantly had to expand its territory. And when we look at the American context, we see that American senators and congressmen are making more and more money through the playing of the stocks in the market, right? So the stock market, we look at Nancy Pelosi, look at Dan Crenshaw. Interesting that so the public officials have to get more and more money, and requiring and having access to more money depends on the expansion of the empire, which is obviously tied to the military-industrial complex, which is exactly part of the American system itself. And we see that probably like Athens, the military-industrial complex is going to be part and parcel for the collapse of the American democratic experiment. Very interesting connection there that I would not have registered until looking into this topic a little bit more. So, the military industrial complex and the lobbyists and the donors and the people that are incentivizing our representatives, who are the only people that we as a democratic republic only have power over. The only thing we have power is our representatives, which is obviously controlled. The super PACs, the political parties, the donors, they get to choose who exactly we can vote for. And yet they are getting wealthier, wealthier, and wealthier through the expansion of the military industrial complex. And that is what the uniparty is. Big pharma, the MIC, the military industrial complex, Israel. These are the things that unify both parties. And it's kind of indicative of the expansion of the empire. So again, also, as I noted, Athenian aristocrats and Greeks, generally nobles, saw democracy as unnatural. They saw it as unjust, and they saw it as incompetent and vulgar. And one of the reasons why they saw it as unjust is they didn't believe that the demos, the average person, deserved the power that they were given under a democratic form of government. Because they believed, like Plato in the Republic, that only the elite should have this power. That only through the rising through the aristocratic and noble structure, only these people that are highly educated, that have access to wealth, only they should be able to make the decisions because they're the competent ones. And so by giving power to the people in Athens, this is unjust. This is unnatural. This is for them vulgar and incompetent. And I'll get to the point of incompetence because this is actually one of the fundamental criticisms of democracy itself, is its incompetency and its inability to focus for long-term goals. And I'm going to bring this up because I got a whole list here of criticisms referring, again, specifically regarding democracy and democracy within the contemporary period. So, the elites, literally in Greece, vowed to do evil to the masses to destroy their democracy. Now, again, I posit, is this possible within the American context? Is it possible that the aristocratic and noble elites that have access to the majority of the money and are not in debt are actually contributing evils to our population to destroy whatever little power the people actually have? It looks to be the case. I think anybody with eyes to see and ears to hear say, well, that seems to be the case. It seems like the same dialectical fight between the few and the many in Athens is also occurring in the American context. However, through technocracy and technology, the few and the elite have more power over the masses than they ever did before. Because at least back in Athens, if you and I all got together, we could go find whoever it is that we didn't like and we could deal with them face to face. But we can't do that today. And part of the technocratic system is what controls this. So in 321, Athens' democracy ends. And this is the end of their golden age. This is the end. This is really what comes next is the Hellenic period. And so this, and part of it, like I said, the ending of the golden age and the end of democracy, one of the things that they did is they added a financial requirement to hold office, meaning once they were conquered by Macedon, they wanted that only the wealthy would be in control again. And so unlike before, where the Thetes, the poor working labor class, sort of low middle class people of Athens, as long as you were male and you were free, whereas before you could participate in the assembly and you could be elevated by lot to the Council of 500, they said, no more. You actually have to make this much money now to even participate. So sorry, guys, middle class, lower middle class, you guys are out. This is only for the wealthy now. And so that kind of signified the end of the golden age of Athenian democracy. Now, I want to move to the American context here and make a few points. Is that in America, Thomas Jefferson had an interesting quote that I found in a conversation with another gentleman where he says, we see the wisdom of Solon's remarks that no more good must be accepted than the nation can bear. Interesting. No more good should be accepted than the nation can bear. Now, obviously, you can view that in a few different ways. And for so long, it had to do with giving power to the demos, the populace, and all this different stuff. And Thomas Jefferson was one who was much more higher on the ideals of democracy, where we look at somebody like a James Madison was much more interested in the restriction of power compared to Jefferson. And I have an academic article, if we have time, I'll read a little bit about that. But I couldn't help but thinking about this again when it comes to Epstein, right? So no more good must be accepted than the nation can bear. Do our leaders think that we can't accept the fact to find out that the majority of people who rule this country are evil, participate in debauchery? I don't know. I'll leave that to you. Is it part of the parcels that they don't think we're ready? We can handle the truth, that it'd be too much good, too much truth? I don't know. I'll leave that for you. But some of the lessons learned from Athens were established within the American context as well. And one of them was class struggle. So America, one of the ways in which they wanted to alleviate the class struggle, which brought down the democracy of Athens, as we already talked about, with raising the amount of money you have to even participate, is they wanted to limit the ability for the few to dominate the many, and they wanted to limit the ability for the many to dominate the few. And so this comes into the checks and balances system. However, few founders, and this is where, at least from my research, I actually push against the video that we watched. From my research, the founders were not heavily influenced by Athens. From what I looked into, the only sources that they would have had at the time of the end of the 18th century to even know about Athenian democracy was Thucydides and Plutarch most specifically. But again, if we look at some of the documents and some of the correspondences between the founding fathers, they noted Athens and what they considered mob rule, because the majority in the assembly really had all the power. They saw this as a problem and they didn't want to go down that path. And so, as I highlighted before, Rome was actually the point in which many of the founding fathers look back to as the ideal state. And this is what gets into republicanism or democracy and whatnot. So here's a little thing on the great influences of Rome on the American government. And so it says here that the study of ancient Roman government reveals a civilization that cycled through almost every form of government, from oligarchy to tyrant and emperor. It's not until the period leading up to its first century BC that the influence of Rome under modern government is clearly visible in history, through when the nation was a republic and control belonged to the Senate. Obviously, we have a Senate, and our legislative branch is broken between the Congress and the Senate, right? And so the Roman government was made up of an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch with varying responsibilities. That's where the American founders got it. And so the executive branch, in times of peace, the executive branch of ancient Rome comprised two councils elected by Roman landowners for 2-year terms. During times of crisis caused by war, a single dictator was elected for 6 months to oversee the protection and expansion of Roman interests. At all times, the executive branch also contained various bureaucrats who were in charge of arranging festivals and conducting census. By contrast, the United States is a democracy with only one leader in the executive branch, the president. Now, I highlighted, as it says right there, that during times of crisis such as war, that they would appoint essentially a dictator. Now, why would that be? Well, as I highlighted, when we look at the efficiency of various government structures, monarchy really is the most efficient. Now, I'm not here to say that every monarchy in history was phenomenal, no, but in an ideal Christian context, in a biblical format, a righteous, pious Christian leader in a monarchical system would be the most efficacious and the most efficient for the benevolence of the majority of the people. And that's why, again, even Rome in crises reverted back to a sort of dictatorship. Now, the legislative, the most influential members of the legislature in Rome were those in the Senate. This large body of elected landowners decided how state money was spent and what projects were viable for state funding. The Senate also took control of foreign policy, in particular, the many wars Rome was engaged in as it expanded its territory throughout the first century BC. The roles assigned to individual senators were allocated by the two councils of the executive branch, the judicial. The judicial branch of ancient Roman government was very similar to the courts, particularly the Supreme Court of modern day America. 6 judges were elected on a biannual basis to administer the law of the land to those who broke it. Unlike the judges in modern US, the Roman judiciary could actively create sentences and punishments instead of merely following past precedent or the sentencing law handed down from the legislative and executive branches. And then another important caveat here is architecture. The great buildings that house various branches of the American government are inspired by Roman architecture. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is seen in the Supreme Court. Cass Gilbert's design draws its inspiration from Roman temple buildings. The staircase, the raised podium, the columns would not be out of place in the Roman Republic. Similarly, the white marble of the Supreme Court and throughout Washington, D.C. was consciously selected to mimic the architectural splendor of ancient Rome. Fluted Doric columns reflecting Roman architecture without any decorations at the top or base are present in many American buildings, including the Federal Hall in New York City. So just wanted to highlight there that when we look at Greek versus Roman influence in the American context, we have to recognize that actually there was much more Roman influence than there was Greek influence. And we're going to get into democracy versus republicanism in just a moment here. So republicanism is interesting because when I was looking at, obviously everybody says, oh, we live in a republic, we don't live in a democracy. True. And because we live in a republic, this is why we have a representative or indirect democracy. So we don't have a direct mob rule democracy. However, many of the founding fathers, when I looked into it, used the words republicanism and democracy interchangeably. And I'll show you why that probably was. So when we look at the etymology, democracy, government of the people, the demos is literally government by the people, And so when we look at res publica, which is the origin for republic, which is Latin, so we hit democracy comes from the Greeks, republican comes from the Latin. And so we have the res publica, or the public interest, the state, essentially meaning the same thing. And this is why many of the founding fathers use these words interchangeably, because essentially republicanism and democracy means rule by the people. However, how that is enacted is different. And many of the founding fathers saw republicanism as the alternative to monarchy. So if you're familiar, obviously that's what World War I was about, was the ending of essentially the monarchies of Europe and around the world to many extent. In that the founding fathers in the late 18th century, they were looking at governmental institutions that were in opposition to what they considered authoritative or tyrant-like structures, specifically monarchy. So this was a huge conversation. And even when we look at the colonists in like newspapers and publications, democracy and republicanism were used interchangeably. So there wasn't an explicit conscious understanding of the differences of these words from the beginning of the country. I just want to highlight that. And so the U.S., when we founded our Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all this different stuff, what they were looking at, they used words like citizen to differentiate from a subject, because it gets back to monarchy. A subject was somebody who was subject to a hierarchical organization, specifically a monarchy. And so the monarch had subjects. And the founders wanted to do away with the idea of subjects and promote the idea of a citizen. And the citizen was associated with a free man. And so a free man was typically associated with somebody who could have private property. Private property was the essential characteristic for the founding fathers of what it meant to be free. That you were not a subject, but you actually had private property that you owned, and that was under your agency. And because you had that, that's what differentiated you from anybody else living in these different governmental structures. So it became the source of personal authority. the ability to own land. And this is why those are the people who were able to vote when the country was founded. It was white men that owned property. So white males, property owners, because if you didn't own property, to some extent in their mind, you weren't fully free yet. You didn't have full authority. And the entire ethos of the American Revolution and the founding of American democracy was to free oneself of the dependency of external systems. It was really, that's why in regards to equality, liberty, and fraternity, you can really replace fraternity with independence in the American context, because the national ethos was about independence, not being dependent upon anybody else or any other thing. And so there's plenty of land to go around. You own land, you grow your own food, you control your own destiny, and therefore you're not dependent on the monarch in England, or you're not dependent upon other external factors. This is what is really meant by the pursuit of happiness, and I would argue in regard to the Constitution. So equality of opportunity, as I said, the point of equality in the original American context was trying to establish a full meritocracy, which they believed had never truly existed at that point. And so the first rejection of the authoritarian power is sort of the number one principle of what the founding fathers wanted to do. And so we see isonomia and isogoria being essential for this. So isogoria, free speech; isonomia is equal under the rule of law. So again, they adopt the first two fundamental principles for democracy in America for the establishment of their resistance to authoritarian power. And so patriotism in the American context became associated with freeing oneself, as I said, from the dependency of external factors, and work in the acquisition of capital became the enterprise as seen as liberating poor people. So right before the revolution, one of the things that was occurring was people were able to acquire wealth at a rate that they had never been able to do previously. So because they're able to acquire wealth, this led to them understanding that the acquisition of capital was essential for freeing poor people. And this is what they thought was happening. So they were going to have more citizens, more free people due to this happening. And then the second was the skepticism of the monopoly of power. So we talked about Shays' Rebellion. Pure democracy was seen as dangerous, the mob rule, and politics was characterized by factions, which we already talked about, and that the representative indirect democracy, that people can control elected officials, but at the same time, they won't have full control over the government itself. So